And great that people could join us in person and online. And it's like an early, isn't it? Feels like an early shift, doesn't it? It's not. Pleasure to introduce David Byres, recently appointed to the role of Chief Nursing Advisor in BC. I first met him when he was in the leadership team and still is on the leadership team at Provincial Healthcare, and is on a secondment for 18 months to his current position. Really looking forward to hearing about his experiences in the role, which he took up in July, and looking forward to hearing about having two offices, one in Victoria and one in Vancouver. I think that'll be interesting as well. And welcome.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about my mandate and what I've been asked to do in terms of creating a nursing policy secretariat for the province of BC. You will see on my slides it says draft plan, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, every time I meet and talk with a group, the plan is constantly being revised and changed based on feedback, and because the formal plan of what we're going to do isn't actually due until the end of April. So I'm in a bit of a phase of consultation, talking to many people around the province. For those of you who are joining online, after I set a bit of context, and then I'll talk about my role and the plan, we'll have a bit of a dialogue because I'm actually interested in all of your advice and feedback. So I'm going to put all of you to work because it is a tremendous opportunity that we have as nurses across the province to begin to influence the work of government and the policy that set and give some feedback on how we want to optimize nursing in BC. So for those of you online, you can either, at that phase of the conversation, press your talk button and ask your question or make your comment, or you'll also be able to type some comments and we can relay them in the room. So this context may be of no surprise to anyone, but just as a reminder in terms of what government is thinking about at the moment as they do their work and set policy and direction for health across the province, they're certainly thinking about the fact that our population continues to age, that there is limited and often delayed access to care, including limited access to primary care. Wait times for procedures, while in some areas across the province are certainly improving, and others they're lengthy. Our emergency departments are congested, and hospitals are operating at or over capacity. So I was up in Northern Health last week, and the day that I was there, their hospital was operating at 130% capacity, so 30% more admitted patients than there were beds on the day that I was there. At the same time, they're thinking about three key populations and what really should be the model of care going forward. So thinking about people who have complex chronic conditions, around frail seniors, and around those with mental health and substance abuse. So this document, I'm sure you're familiar with, but if you're not, I'll bring it to your attention. It's available publicly. You can Google it online, Setting Priorities for the BC Health System. This is the strategic direction for health from the province of BC. So this is driving government's direction, and it drives the work of the health authorities. There are a number of goals within this document and strategies that government has laid out. And in addition, they have released a number of policy papers to support this document, some that you may be familiar with. So there is a policy paper on primary and community care, for example, one on surgical services, on patient-centered care, and a health human resource plan. The primary and community care policy, for example, talks about a real shift away from acute care and trying to strengthen the primary and community care system with some goals, for example, like reducing emergency department visits by 20% across the province. And the surgical services paper really focused on what's the right model and structure and work that needs to happen to improve access to surgical care. There are 8 priorities within that document. First being providing patient-centered care. I get to have the great job of being very curious as I have dialogue with people across the province. The other thing I get to do is sometimes be a bit provocative. I never know what I say that might be provocative. So this may or may not be provocative, but also that just the system we have created in terms of health has really been built around the provider. And it's a great system that generally works well for all of us who are providing care. It doesn't necessarily work well for those who are receiving care. And we can continue to advance that and do more work around patient-centered care. And then, of course, as I said, there's a real work happening on how we switch our care system from the acute center focus to a much more robust primary and community system that can really be built around interprofessional teams and functions. And then how do we create the right kind of interface between what needs to be in an acute care system of the future, what really needs to be in a core acute care hospital versus what could be managed in primary and community care. There are 7 strategies that government's laid out in that document to help them achieve that goal. I'll just point out number 5, which relates a little bit to what we'll talk about today, which is that they're interested in how do we really create an optimized, engaged workforce, the right kind of workforce, well-led, healthy workforce. So, back in April, the Ministry of Health started to talk to me about the potential of creating a role to advise government around nursing and create some structures around nursing and where we might actually go to. And so where we landed by the end of July when I started this role was that I have a mandate that really has 2 broad pieces. The first is government does not believe that they are effectively using the knowledge and expertise of nursing in the province, that they could better optimize the role of nurses, and they're not completely clear on what the best way is to do that. So they have asked me to come back and recommend to them how do we optimize the role, scope, function, and education of nurses within the province to better support patients, to create the kind of roles and practice environments we would want, and to better support government in achieving its objectives. As part of that work, I will come back and recommend what are the ongoing roles that should exist within government on an ongoing basis to represent nursing, and what is the structure around it so that that expertise, that knowledge that nursing has and brings is instilled into government on an ongoing permanent basis and helps drive and shape the health policy they will set in the future. So you may be aware there's some structures around other groups that exist for them to give input into government and the work that they do and the policies that they create. And they're interested in creating the same for nursing. When I talk about nursing, it's the broadest definition of the family. So it includes licensed practical nurses, registered psychiatric nurses, and nurse practitioners. So in terms of my plan and what's happening right now, let me see if I can just move this. All of the health authorities are currently doing an environmental scan for me that will be completed this month. They are looking at the most recent amendments to the nursing regulations. And based on the most recent amendments of the regulations, where are they actually at in terms of what they are allowing in practice versus what the regulations actually say is possible. And where the regulations say a nurse could do something, or an LPN could, or an NP could, and they don't have it in practice, why is that? And so that I'll also get information that says, it may just be, we're interested, we haven't got there. There may be barriers to implement that around their information system, around PharmEd or other policies, or they may not have implemented it because they think there's some risk. And so sometime by the end of this month, I will have a real sense of what the regulations actually say can happen in practice versus what the reality is. And the regulators in the most recent amendments have been fairly progressive, if you've read the most recent amendments, which sort of says nursing practice could be here, and where we are is about here. Now, some of that is simply a result of the amendments being new. So as one example, in the recent amendments to the registered nurse regulation, it actually says that any registered nurse can prescribe any Schedule I medication. And they can prescribe Schedule II medications for specific conditions. That won't be implemented anywhere yet because the College of Registered Nurses is still working on what standards, limits, and conditions may need to be around that to actually implement it, and they won't have that complete until February. It's just one example. While that is happening, I am traveling around the province talking to registered nurses, psychiatric nurses, licensed practical nurses, and NPs, as well as many other stakeholders on what it means to them to optimize nursing practice. What would that look like? What would they want to see changed or strengthened or left as is? And if you had the opportunity to come back to government to make some recommendations, what would they actually be? And what do you believe that structure needs to look like to make sure your voice, your knowledge, and your expertise is represented in government and helping to shape the work that they do? As I'm having that dialogue, I'm not just focused on acute care settings. So I have been in primary care, community care, public health settings, rural and remote, some specific areas like mental health and addictions, as well as residential and other older adult settings, and speaking to a variety of nursing leaders around the province and collecting a whole bunch of information that when the consultation is done, I'll begin to synthesize into some themes. As part of my mandate, I have the ability to review any of the legislation, the regulations, the standards, limits, and conditions, or any other barriers or supports that affect nursing practice and make recommendations back to government on how they may need to change for the future. Whether or not there'll be any significant change yet, I don't know, because as I've said, with sort of a right touch approach and being quite progressive, the regulations actually allow a much, much broader practice for nursing in the province without a single change than we actually have implemented. There's also a whole structure around the regulation of nursing practice within the province. Sometimes that involves named agencies or certified practices or decision support tools. And as I have been talking with employers and all of the regulators, there is agreement that while it was the right thing to do at the time when it was introduced, there are challenges to that kind of governance structure that they've never really sorted through. And if there is a different way to think about in the future, they're all interested in working together to determine that. I don't know yet what that might look like. And then some question from nurses in practice and others if every certified practice needs to continue to remain as a certified practice today. So that's just some of the feedback coming up from nurses. It was certainly new and was, when we introduced it, certified practice was the right way to manage it. Here we are a number of years later and questioning whether nursing practice has advanced enough that it needs to be thought of more in terms of practice for all nurses. This review of the structure and the regulation and standards, limits, conditions is not intended to be a one-time only process. So I've been asked to create a process to do this that will occur annually. So at some point each year, there'll be a pause and review. Does the regulation and legislation still optimize practice in the way we want it to? Now, I'm getting all sorts of interesting feedback from around the province, but there are also some specific things I've been asked to consider. It can be much broader than this based on the feedback that I'm getting, and consider doesn't mean all will move forward. All of them may move forward, or none, or some, depending on the work that has to happen. So I've been asked to consider more broadly prescribing by registered nurses and registered psychiatric nurses around suturing, their ability to order some lab orders and diagnostics, and also the ability for nurses to discharge in a standardized manner. That could be, for example, criteria-based discharge, where whoever is the most responsible provider, whether that's a physician or NP, has laid out criteria, like if this patient's creatinine is at this level and this occurs, the patient can be discharged home to expedite that flow, as an example. We've had a role that we do have some registered nurses trained in the province. The RN First Assist role, BCIT used to have a program to do this. It was introduced in the early 2000s, additional training and clinical time, so they have an expanded scope in terms of suturing, work they can do below the dermis, hemodynamic stability, their ability to manage hemorrhage, and they have a much broader scope within the perioperative or surgical setting. I've been asked to look at that again. RN First Call is a certified practice within BC, so it is used in some areas, but not necessarily widely. To also really think about nursing's role within primary healthcare and what broadly could be nurses' contributions, both potentially in terms of working in existing primary care practices and how that might enhance it, as well as independent roles that nurses may have in primary care settings, their own clinics or elsewhere, NPs, RNs, LPNs, RPNs, and how that could contribute overall to a much strengthened primary healthcare system across the province. And then I've been asked to think about RN anesthetists. In terms of LPN practice, I've been asked to think about what could be a standardized provincial scope for LPN. So thinking about the use of licensed practical nurses within operating room settings, that is, it varies across the province right now. There are some health authorities that use LPNs consistently in the ORs. Some, it depends on whether it's a circulating or a scrub role, and some are not using them at all. Thinking about LPN immunization, their role with IV therapy, including some IV medication, advanced wound care, and what role they might be able to play, and do play now, in community care and palliative care. And for registered psychiatric nurses, given some parallels in some parts of the education, whether we are using them effectively in other general medical positions. Are there some more medical areas where their role might be useful and consider a different use for them? The last thing I'll just comment on, if you are a nurse who falls under the Nursing Bargaining Association collective agreement, there is what's called the PRF process. It's the professional responsibility form. And if you are a nurse and you are working and something in your environment or an action by the employer affects your ability to maintain your standards of practice, you know, the intent is you would have a conversation with your manager or the charge nurse or whoever and try and resolve that. If it isn't resolvable or doesn't resolve and your ability to actually maintain your standards of practice continues to be impacted, you can fill out this form which initiates a very structured process to review that, all the way to a review by an external committee, and they will make recommendations. There is a new step that has been added. So if it goes all the way to external committee and either the union or the employer is not satisfied with that decision and they believe there's some broad policy or system implications, they can refer that to me through the Nursing Policy Secretariat for final review. So if we begin to collaborate as nurses across the province and start to define what does optimized practice look like and what do we want nurses to look like in 3 or 5 years and create a plan to get there, that also means we need to think about nursing education and how are we educating people for that optimized practice. Does the education we provide still prepare nurses for that type of practice environment and practice settings, or do we need to think about anything else in terms of a provincial approach? And then how would that affect the role of the colleges, the regulatory colleges, in approving schools to actually teach? As all this work continues, and why I started with that strategic plan and the policy statement, I've been asked to write a provincial policy for nursing that will be released by government. It will have lots of time for feedback and people to review and make comments that ultimately will drive and speak to nursing practice, nursing regulation, and education and move it forward, and will likely comment on nursing leadership. The plan of how we're going to get there is, as I said, not due until April, and then we will move forward and do the work. So with that context, I'm going to actually turn it over to all of you in the room with me and all of you online. And no matter how out of the box your comments might be, I encourage you to make them, to ask questions, to make suggestions. I can assure you, you're not thinking as out of the box as I'm thinking. So if you were me and you had the opportunity to consult with people such as yourself across the province, thinking about the multiple areas that nurses work in, from primary and community and acute to rural and remote, their roles in education, their roles in leadership, how would you tell government they should optimize the role of nursing in British Columbia? Those of you online can use the chat feature, and I'll go to Sabrina.
Thanks a lot for your talk, and thanks for coming and spending this time with us. It's great. I actually want to pose a question to you.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm not going to answer your question. I could say a lot. I'm happy to write a letter to you if you'd like around optimizing the roles around primary and community care, because I've done that already, and sent one on to the government through the faculty of medicine position. But what I'm wondering is the governance structure within the Ministry of Health. And so you talked a little bit at the beginning around how they want to have more of a dialogue and have nurses directly basically sit at the table with them in terms of influencing policy and healthcare. And I'm wondering, how do you think the government ought to work? Or how do you think we can do this in a way that's going to work in the government? Because right now there's the joint clinical committees, which are shared. There's shared care, which is the health authorities and specialists and the government. Then there's general practice service committee, which is the GPs mostly. There's some health authority people, and then there's the government folks. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see that nurses can, do you think that we can have a different governance structure so that we can get to interprofessional care, or do you think we're going to have to try to fit in some way into their pre-existing structures? Because we're now talking about, the kind of the political stuff, right, with doctors at BC and the Ministry of Health, et cetera. And so I'm worried that, if we as nurses say, well, here's a structure that would work, that it's actually going to just silo everything again. So we have nurses because they wanted to talk with the government themselves. We have the physicians doing their thing, and eventually, you have pharmacists and things goes on and on. So I'm wondering what you're thinking about that.
What I'm thinking is that form should follow function. I have to have a better sense of where we want to go in terms of optimization to really answer what's the right structure. I would suspect it will be a combination of what we have talked about. There will be some structures where nursing needs to be better represented at the table with more authority or involvement. And there will need to be some structure that is becomes the work of the policy secretary to drive some of this ultimately forward. What that will look like, I'm not far enough along yet to know, but I can tell you that they fully expect, that I'm going to come back and be recommending changes to their existing structure. So they are fully prepared and expecting pieces of work that may report elsewhere within the ministry. I may come back and say, actually, I think that's better aligned to fall under the direction of the policy secretary and not be off here isolated, that it needs to have a stronger connection to nursing. Now, ultimately what that will all look like, I don't know, because I need to really understand what we need to achieve to know the structure is going to allow us to get there. And if you have thoughts about that, I would love to hear. And then we'll go back to Leanne.
Yeah, I had a question around, or maybe perhaps suggestion, because we had recently here some discussion from an educational perspective as to, where to send our students for clinical practice, and there is a huge shift towards home care, and then we had presentation about government promotion of home care. But what I was curious about is whether there is a vision from nursing that there could be more leadership, clinical leadership, for instance, by expanding opportunities for nurse practitioners to actually then also supervise, because I feel that we don't necessarily optimally use our own ability to lead over the sort of hierarchy that we have created, more nurses into those new areas.
I think that's absolutely possible. The issue of placements is probably one issue that I've heard about almost every single group. So I am doing a little bit of background work that'll start us off in some discussion and potentially creating a framework around education. I'll begin to have some discussions with CNOs and deans and directors and Nurse Educator Council of BC. Not that I'm coming with here's what it's going to be, but some structure potentially where we could go, and then we'll have to work with them about what happens and how we move forward. But certainly, not only do we want to optimize the role and contribution of nurses, but as we're educating people, the ability to use all that expertise to train people will be paramount. At the same time, I suspect we'll have to balance it against what we may need the NPs to do or be involved in with NPs or other students, but certainly there's an opportunity for them to provide more mentorship. And it's always been my experience anywhere that you have an advanced practice nurse, the practice of nursing overall is raised and elevated as a result of involving the CNS or NP as part of that team. Yeah.
I'm going to speak. I agree 100% about the nurse practitioner role is not maximized in the province. But I wonder, where do you see informatics sitting in this list? It's a cross-cutting thing, but it's also evolving in other countries as its own thing. So having a chief nursing informatics officer at a regional level is even being put forward in Ontario. It's popping up in a lot of other countries as well. I just wonder where do you see technology?
Well, you're going to educate me because you and I are meeting to talk about that. So I'm not an expert by any means in all those areas, and that's why I'm not talking to so many people and trying to pull all that information in. Certainly, as we go forward, the ability to use technology and those kind of roles will enhance the impact that nursing can play. When I think that anyone on my iPhone, I can FaceTime with and have a conversation. Even that small impact that could play in the role of primary and community care to connect with the patients. Or, we're not always thinking about technology as the way to actually extend our impact and reach as well as how we connect with patients. But you're going to educate me and help me figure that out. Sally and then.
One of the things you said toward the end of talking about your plan is that it would likely comment on nursing leadership. And I'm just wondering if that expresses a hesitation of going there or...
Not on my part whatsoever, and I already have the commitment from our associate deputy that I can include them.
Because I think some of us think that rebuilding that system of nursing leadership so that nurses know who to learn from is essential to all of us.
Yeah, I can say this because I've said it to CEOs, I've said it to others. I am deeply concerned about the state of nursing leadership in the province and the erosion of nursing leadership, not about any single leader who are doing excellent work, but where you sit makes a difference.
So this is going to be a little bit stream of consciousness, so be prepared to be said outside the box.
Yeah.
There's a few things. One is I've heard rumors about this idea of setting up some kind of standardized educational programs across the province. And I would like to register strong objection to that. And my reason for registering strong objection is not because I don't think it's important to pay attention to our standards of education, but I don't think we want to create a box and then put every nursing program in that box and not allow any opportunities for nursing education programs to be innovative or come up with new strategies because it's so regulated that there just isn't any space for that. And we were having a conversation the other day in the PhD seminar, and we were talking actually about information technology and what implications that could have for nurses. And one of the things we were talking about is this idea that everything has to be standardized and we have to have protocols for everything and we have to have decision trees. And we're getting to a place now where I think we're starting to take critical judgment out of the whole picture of what nurses do because they're so controlled by, well, you do this, that, and the other thing. And I was just thinking about that when you were talking about ways that you could discharge patients under some standardized protocol. But what if, the nurse is looking at that patient and thinking, I don't think this person should go home, but they're meeting all the criteria that have been set up for this anyway. So I think that information technology has the possibility or the potential to create that on steroids. And I don't want to get to a place where the government thinks that you could put robots in there and they would do what needs to be done for the patient population. So I think it's really important that we support nurses' critical judgment and their critical thinking in any kind of clinical setting we're in. And I'll just say one more thing and then I promise I'll stop. And so the other thing is we got something from UBC Health and we've been asked to respond to it. And frankly, I don't know how to respond to it, so I haven't. And it's not, but I sent him an email saying we need to talk. And it's not that I don't get that we're an aging population and I don't get what's going on in the acute care settings and all the rest of it. But this is around mental health, which AKA stands for dementia, management of diabetes and obesity, and I forget what the third thing is. But it's all illness-based and it's all around, let's see where we can slot what your program's doing into these illness-based criteria or plot that we've created. And I don't even know how to go there because I feel that it doesn't even reflect a lot of what we're teaching nursing students to think about and do. So I'm having to struggle with that. And for community care, for health promotion, I feel like that's almost completely dropped off the agenda. And I would like to actually see some money in BC to do some bedside research so that people like community health nurses who are trying to do health promotion with families can actually demonstrate that their care is making a difference. And we have none of that here. And it's almost impossible to get access to a lot of funding. Okay, I'll stop.
So you had a lot of comments. I can't comment what the university is doing. I would agree with you, mental health and addictions is much broader. I can tell you the one area of practice from nurses who work in direct care that I've heard consistently across the province is how ill and underprepared they feel they are when it comes to mental health addictions. And that's not just from nurses who are working in the area, because nurses in medicine, surgery, and cardiac and community have that as part of their practice, and they feel very uncertain. In terms of your comments about, let's allow nurses to really optimize their critical thinking and that ability to coordinate and make their own decisions and support a standardized protocol for every person that has presented that point of view. I have other nurses who are afraid about, do they have the knowledge and skill to do that? Were they adequately prepared to do that? What's the impact on them and their practice if I make that decision? So there is both sides of that coin in terms of the conversation I'm having now. Lots of people just like you, let's really push the envelope, and nurses could really be contributing in a much greater way. But the nurse at point of care making those decisions has some hesitation in certain situations around doing that, which goes back to then the education. How do we, one, support people to do that now, and then how do we educate people for entry to practice in that kind of environment in the future? I just will check if there's some comments online.
We do have a few questions already online. The first one's from Aggie Black, and she asks, how can we work together to expand the numbers of NPs practicing in BC? Any chance for moving NPs to a fee-for-service model?
So I will, I'm in an advisory role, and I certainly will take feedback. I will tell you my own personal belief is fee-for-service for NPs would be the wrong model. It would drive a certain kind of practice that does not really optimize the knowledge and skill of the nurse practitioner. That said, do I think it's possible to get to a model to better utilize and integrate NPs both into existing primary care settings as well as have them contribute independently around primary care? Yes, absolutely. I do think we could get there. The BC Nurse Practitioner Association, I did a little bit of work with them and gave some input into a paper that they have now released on the role of NPs and a different kind of model and structure. And they did that and sent that back to government, which is starting some dialogue. There are some tests of concept that will occur around the province on some different models as that dialogue continues. So I think it's absolutely possible. You will remember historically that there was discussion around GP for me with the intent of getting every person in the province to have a family physician. And while thousands of people have family physicians, thousands do not. And so they're looking now not so much at GP for me, but also thinking about primary care provider for me. And GPs are absolutely a critical part of that solution, but so could NPs be. And so I think that's part of the dialogue we need to have and the recommendations we need to get back. If you were going to ask me personally, because my role is to advise the ministry about fee-for-service, I would not be supportive of that kind of model, but you can try and convince me otherwise.
We have two questions from Hannah McDonald. The first one is how will your plan address the retention of nurses in practice? And the second one is what is meant by a provincial approach for nursing education and review of conditions by the colleges?
So, sir, can you say the first question?
How will your plan address the retention of nurses in practice?
Well, I guess I would ask you to comment or put in your chat box, how do you want us to address that and what should we look at differently? Because that's what this sort of phase of work is really gathering information and suggestions, not for me to personally say this is what I think has to happen and that's the end of the story. So I'll throw my contact info up on the last slide and you can certainly connect with me. I'm happy to connect with you by phone or by email. I'd be interested in what your thoughts are. The conditions around the college, in BC, the regulatory colleges approve educational institutions to teach nursing, and they each have a process by which to go through that. So if we are beginning to shape and change what entry to practice looks like and how we educate, that may need an examination of the work of the colleges. And then the standardized part really is about what should entry to practice education look like in the future. If we collaborate and make recommendations on what optimal practice is and where do we want nursing to be in 3 to 5 years. What does that mean for how we're actually preparing people for the reality of practice? And if we are working on a shift away from acute care, not that acute care isn't an important part of the continuum, it always will be, but what really needs to be in acute care and how do we strengthen primary community care, what does that mean for the role of nurses in the future, their contribution, and how we train them in terms of both their formal education and the clinical placements they get, what does entry practice look like, and what does that mean for the curriculum?
So thinking about that shift and expansion of nursing into primary health care and into community health, and especially like I think about in my area, comprehensive school health or the school health roles and health services for children and youth. This may be a accurate or inaccurate, but it seems to me that a big part of the structuring of this is following the money trail. You talked about fee-for-service, and our primary healthcare system is set up at the moment with GPs providing 2.5-minute, clinical things so that they can actually bill, eyes on patients, to actually be able to bill. And there are very few outside of the health authority run public or community health clinics, very few of the GPs that I know of who actually incorporate nurses or nursing practice into their care, because then there's no way to sort of bill for those services, and there's, they're not going to share their fee for the fee for care in that way. So it doesn't make good fiscal sense for your independent or family practice clinics today. So,
and I do think, however, there is an opportunity to begin to test some models where it's possible to fund those roles in existing primary care practices, both within practices, clinics that are under the health authority, as well as those that are owned and managed and led by a or a group of GPs. And based on the population they serve, to add in the role of nursing, whether that's a licensed practical nurse, or it could be an RN, or it could be a psychiatric nurse, depending on the population, or it could be an NP. Now, if government does that, and there's an opportunity to do that, then the expectation on the other side is likely going to be related to attachment. So if we can provide an NP and the associated infrastructure into your practice, the expectation would be then attachment increases, right? The panel size for the practice increases, more people are attached, more people then have a primary healthcare provider. And there are examples of that around the province. I was just a few weeks ago in Ladysmith, where the bulk of the primary care was in the community was done by a collaborative practice. So there are a couple of physicians, there are a couple of NPs, and there are a couple of RNs. And they do all the primary health care. And the bulk of it, if you arrive, you are actually attached to the NP. Something may occur that you need to see the physician for, but if your primary health care is you come back and see that NP every time. And when I talk with the physicians and NPs, there's work that the RNs do. They don't touch because they don't have the expertise. So if you're coming in for immunizations or some well-being or pap smears, or you have a wound, the RN is who you're going to see when you arrive at the practice, not the NP, not the physician. And so they're really thinking about how to maximize the roles in their clinic and in turn provide primary care for their whole community.
when it comes to schools, this is a put a bug in your ear about intersectoral collaboration around roles. Right now, the Ministry of Health has a focus when it comes to children and youth to deal with comprehensive school health, which is useful because that's where most of the kids are most of the day.
Yeah.
But their definition of comprehensive school health, which is mostly driven within sort of a collaboration between education and health, but seems to be more on the education side than the health side. One of the pillars is community partnerships, and that is bringing sort of that health relationship into the in partnership with the schools. But fascinatingly, at the ministerial level, the documentation, the discussion, what can healthcare providers of any stripe be doing in fostering comprehensive school health is almost exclusively to provide consultation to health education or health teaching in schools, and not about school-linked clinics or school-based clinics, or even public health nurses being school nurses in, like the variety of different things you can do. And conversations like immunizations that happen in schools aren't even visible, and yet that's a really big part of comprehensive school health.
Yeah.
Is there, thinking about as you're going forward with the policy, I think it's also important to think about those linkages between some of the other ministries and how health does or doesn't have a nursing lens when they're because there's stuff that's happening in public health with nurses, but you wouldn't know it in terms of talking to education.
And in an earlier slide, you will see public health is now in there. It wasn't when I started out.
Really?
Your colleagues in public health, as I've talked around, have raised exactly that, and the importance of not forgetting that primary and community care includes public health and a lot of what drives. And so the nurses who are actually doing that work have raised a lot of just what you have spoken about. So it will feed into the plan as we begin to think about how do we synthesize and get back to the right structure to move forward. I'm just checking in if we have comments online.
Yeah, we have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. For comments, we have something from Sandra LaChapelle, who says, barriers to NP practice, example form completion, need to be removed. NPs should be set up to work together to support each other rather than linked with physicians, which can be a challenging situation.
I would 100% agree. There are some forms right now that are a big challenge for NP completion. So some of them I've gotten involved in. I'm sure I don't know all of them. I'll just give you one example is the MOST form. It's a form that documents end-of-life conversations and what the patient or client's wishes are should something actually occur. And right now, in many health authorities, the NPs are unable to sign that form. So I'm working with people in the ministry and the college and really beginning to try and understand why that is and make whatever changes need to happen to get that solved. So I'm fully and becoming more and more aware of that, and in the background trying to do work with the CNOs, government, and the regulators to get that resolved.
And another comment from Roger Oshio. I feel the frontline nursing, both novice and experienced, need more education/information on their full potential scope of practice. My context is very acute focused, and the majority of acute care nurses do not fully appreciate the potential for their role as nurses.
And what would he suggest? As I said at the beginning, the regulators have taken sort of this right touch approach to regulation. I've tried to be quite progressive and thinking about the contribution of nursing. So the most recent amendments in each of the nursing regulations have actually broadened nursing practice quite substantively. We in practice, and employers and across the province, have not caught up to the regulators. They're ahead of us all in terms of the potential for nursing to have a much broader role in terms of their practice and scope and independence and autonomy. So it's also, I think we have to start to work with the employers and others about how do we actually maximize that in a way that's safe and appropriate, and then begin to think about some of those other roles and areas as we do that work to go forward and really define what we want practice to actually look like and how do we support nurses to actually practice in that way.
I have a question building on discussions about how the nurses get paid and supported in order to step up to these kinds of roles. Because if we want them to expand the scope, and especially at the front line, is there thinking about really having them also structure of paid internship or resident roles or something so that nurses can build their confidence?
because I think now the turnover essentially in those roles is so high, but that is in part because there is no supportive structure. But I think that supportive structure not only through mentorship, but also really building on the basic education to have a paid period of transition. And I don't know whether there's openness within the government to expand those kinds of roles.
Well, I think we're still in the consultation phase, but certainly that concept has come up from nurses in direct care, and I've spoken to some nurses who are within their first 2 years or less of practice, and they have talked about feeling quite impressed, confident, satisfied with the education. What they have asked us to think about differently is the preceptorship. And they consistently say it did not allow me the time to really solidify the skills, and suddenly I'm out there independently practicing and I feel quite scared and anxious. And they bring up the concept of an internship. Is there an opportunity to extend the preceptorship or have it look differently to give me more supported, mentored time to actually solidify my skills? So a lot of newer nurses in practice have raised that question. Hi.
My name is Jen. I was a military nurse for 10 years in my history of nursing. And so I think it's interesting expanding the role and the scope of nursing, because as a civilian nurse, your scope of nursing is different than as a military nurse. You tend to probably be a little bit truer to a more extended role. And I think that a mentoring or preceptorship or, I guess, trainee type model of a fellowship in nursing in early practice years is probably close to how that was managed in the military. So I think that can work. I was going to talk a little bit about, we had a slide back that talked about nurses being involved in discharge more closely, and I'm curious about why nurses would admit patients to different healthcare settings as well. So not only do nurses kind of know when people are ready to go to a different healthcare setting, we usually know when they are ready not to be there anymore because it isn't safe or whatever. And so, and I don't think this is a very original thought at all, but nurses probably should admit patients to acute care because patients are in acute care for nursing care. Otherwise, they would be at home and going to their family doctor or going to specialists, right? So, do you see that something like that would evolve out of an expanded or optimized role for nursing?
It may in certain areas. That would require, your answer, what is going to happen if that means legislative change. Actually, it's driven in part by legislation. So for NPs, there's been required changes so that the health authority or the employer can actually set up the process to have them admit or discharge. For other members of the nursing family, that would require legislative change in partnership with them and our physician colleagues. Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible, and I think it's really about defining what do we want practice to actually look like and what's the best structure and mechanism for that to actually happen. And if some legislative change, as you saw early on, that is part of what I've been given as my mandate is to look at, what are the legislative, regulatory, or other barriers that might impede where we can really make a contribution to better support patients and get better health outcomes across the world. So I'll just start wrapping up with the last couple of questions. I'll take one in the room, we'll check online. Leah?
Just want to float the idea, where does residential care sit in this picture? I know it's...
No, absolutely part of the setting. I've been meeting with a number of nurses in residential, and we have settings, and I'm doing some more in the next couple of weeks. In terms of if anybody's online, where I'll be this Thursday and Friday, I'm traveling through Vancouver Island, I think starting in Nanaimo and throughout the island. Next week I'm in Terrace and then Fort St. John and other places around the province into January. So if there are anyone online, if there's places you think you would like me to come and have a conversation, feel free to get in touch with me. My email is on the phone, or you can get in touch with Cheryl. We would be happy to arrange either to come in person or come on the phone, or there's some rural and remote nurses who work across the First Nations Health Authority, for example. We're going to work with us to do something by video conferencing. So I'm happy to continue to engage with as many people as I can. Any comments online?
Yeah, we have a question from Suzanne Campbell asking how can we optimize the role of nurse leaders in the province, and then a comment from Julia Benucci, as we move forward with expanding scope of nurses, we will need to be clear about the non-nursing work we will need to let go of.
Yeah, so just Suzanne's comment, that's a little bit related to where do we need to go in terms of practice. It also speaks, I think, to being very careful, strategic, and intentional around what the structure is we create, and then thinking about what should be in the policy paper to speak to leadership, because there are tables that nursing leaders do not sit at that I think are important for nurses to be a part of. I'm sorry, can you just remember the last one?
Was just a comment, and as we move forward with expanding the scope of nurses, we will need to be clear about the non-nursing work we will need to let go of.
So I'd be interested to hear more about that and have some conversation. So I think that could certainly be part of the optimization of nursing, but also thinking about the whole healthcare team and how do we optimize the work that needs to happen, best use everyone's skills and abilities, and ultimately better support the patient. So if you have any other feedback, those of you online, my email is on there. Please feel free to email anytime or call anytime, or you can leave me a voicemail. I'm happy to get back to you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this work, and hopefully I will see you in some other venue and be coming back with some work and structure to start to get your input and advice on as we proceed. Thank you.